The prairie sun was sinking low, spilling red fire across the wide horizon when the whispers began in town. Folks leaned close over creaking saloon tables, trading words half in jest and half in disbelief. The rancher out on the edge of the valley, hard-working, weather-worn, stubborn as a mule, was bringing not one bride home but two. And not just any brides. They were Apache women, their braids tied with hawk feathers, their eyes as steady as the desert stars. By the time the news drifted down every dusty street, laughter had taken root. His own kin shook their heads in mockery, saying he had lost all sense, tangled up in some wild notion that could never last. To them it was folly, a scandal that would drag the family name through dirt deeper than cattle tracks after a storm. What no one knew, what no one even dared to imagine, was that these two women carried a legacy more powerful than gossip or shame. For in their hands rested quiet authority over a herd of 200 horses, a wealth that could make or break fortunes in those rugged lands. The rancher had spent years carving out a living from earth that offered little kindness. Each morning before dawn, he rode across brittle grasslands that cracked under his boots, chasing strays, mending fences, branding calves that bore his iron mark. His family watched from the sidelines, their voices always reminding him he was chasing too much, stretching too thin, bound to fall short. Yet the man was never one for easy approval. He had known loneliness, had known the kind of silence that creeps in when a fire dies too soon in the hearth. So when fate set him in the path of those two women sisters of the land, carrying dignity in their step, he listened not to his kin, but to the quiet pull in his chest. He saw strength where others saw strangeness. He saw alliance where others mocked difference. The day he brought them into town. Dust rising behind the wagon wheels, every eye followed. Children gawked from behind fence posts. Merchants paused mid-handshake. And even the blacksmith's hammer missed its mark on iron. Folks saw feathers and buckskin and called it spectacle. His family saw him step down from the wagon, his hands steady as he offered each woman a respectful arm, and they muttered behind pressed lips. They whispered about pride lost, about bloodlines muddied, about ranching traditions torn apart. They never once asked what he had gained. The truth was, the two women carried more than beauty. They carried stories in their voices. Stories of the earth that still remembered the sound of wild hooves before fences cut the land apart. Their people had ridden with those horses, moved with them like shadows under the moon. They could track a trail through broken sagebrush, read signs in the wind, and calm the wildest stallion with nothing but a song. Yet the rancher's family saw none of this. To them, it was nothing but a reckless marriage that deserved ridicule. Around the supper table, the laughter stung worse than whiskey. His brothers slapped their knees, saying he'd gone soft, letting himself be ruled by women who'd never understand cattle work. His sisters shook their heads, whispering prayers about shame. Even the old matriarch of the family declared that he had cursed the ranch with his foolishness. The man sat quiet through it all, his jaw tight, his gaze steady, never offering defense. For he knew something they didn't, something he had only glimpsed but trusted with every bone in his body. The land had a way of humbling men who thought they held all the power. Fences broke, rivers dried, blizzards stripped cattle from the range. Wealth slipped away as easy as dust through open fingers. But horses, 200 of them, were a different kind of power. They were freedom harnessed, trade alive with possibility, survival waiting at the edge of ruin. And those two women, his brides, were tied to them in ways deeper than kinship. They had grown up with the herd, knowing each mare and foal as family. Commanding respect from beasts no man could tame alone. The rancher's family mocked because they could not see beyond the narrow fence posts of their thinking. They didn't notice how the women stood side by side with quiet confidence, how their eyes met his with unspoken trust. They didn't notice the subtle signs, the glint of hooves on the far ridge, the faint rumble that sometimes echoed at dusk when the wind carried the sound of many hearts beating as one. He noticed, he kept their secret close, letting the mockery roll over him like storm clouds bound to pass. Nights were long on the frontier, filled with coyotes crying at the edges of the dark. Around the fire, the women told him more, revealing pieces of their heritage that outsiders never heard. They spoke of horses not as possessions, but as companions of spirit, their hooves drumming the memory of freedom into the soil. They spoke of herds that stretched far before soldiers and settlers carved the land into plots. Their voices carried sorrow and strength, and he listened, humbled. Every word deepened his resolve that his choice was no mistake, no foolish gamble, but a path set by something larger than himself. Still, the mocking grew. Neighbors whispered about the odd trio on the ranch, spinning tales sharper than barbed wire. At church, benches shifted away, hymns sung louder to cover uncomfortable silence. In town meetings, his suggestions were brushed aside, as though his voice carried no weight. His own kin began treating him like a stranger under his own roof. Yet through it all, he worked the land, his brides at his side. Their presence unshaken by scorn, there came a day when laughter would turn to silence. When those who ridiculed would reckon with truths they had overlooked. For out beyond the hills the ground trembled with the restless stir of hooves. 200 horses, sleek and strong, waited for a signal only the women could give. A fortune hidden in plain sight, a legacy bound by blood and trust, ready to change the fate of the ranch forever. But that day had not yet arrived. The rancher bore the weight of ridicule, his kin blind to the treasure they dismissed. His brides kept their knowledge guarded, their eyes always on the horizon, as though waiting for a storm. And somewhere, beyond the hills, the herd shifted restlessly, a secret growing too large to stay hidden much longer. The laughter of his family still rang in his ears, but he knew it would not last. For soon the land itself would answer back, and when it did, no one would mock again. The days that followed moved slow, like molasses in winter, but every hour seemed to hold its own kind of weight. The rancher kept working as he always had, sun up to sundown, hands blistered from mending wire, shoulders sore from driving cattle. Yet life was no longer the same. His brides walked the land with him, their quiet presence shaping the ranch in ways no one outside could ever understand. They knew how to spot signs of sickness in a calf before it turned weak, how to read the sky for storms that had not yet shown their face, how to walk among wild creatures without startling them. Their knowledge seemed to come from the land itself, carried in their blood. And while neighbors and kin only saw feathers and braids, he saw something deeper. He saw the way the soil seemed to trust them, the way even the restless wind seemed to pause when they passed. Still, the whispers in town did not die. Folks grew bolder in their ridicule. A shopkeeper refused to serve them unless the rancher went in alone. A preacher spoke in riddles during his sermon, words about straying from God's plan that hung heavy in the air, though he never said a name. Even children took to mocking behind their backs, tending to prance like horses and laughing when they thought no one was listening. The rancher's family joined in at times, though their cruelty carried more sting than the town's ignorance. Around gatherings, his brothers joked that he had married into poverty. His cousins sneered, saying he was no true rancher anymore but a dreamer chasing shadows. He bore it all in silence because he knew the truth would one day turn every sneer into shame at night. When the fire burned low, the women began sharing more of their world with him. They spoke of the horses as though they were not simply animals, but kin. The herd had always belonged to their people, moving freely across the valleys long before fences cut the land. Each horse carried stories, marked by patterns in its coat, by the scars on its hide, by the bloodline that stretched far into memory. The sisters knew every detail. They remembered which foals had stumbled their first steps, which mares had defended the herd from wolves, which stallion had once led them over the mountains when soldiers swept the plains. Their bond was not ownership. It was kinship, old as the hills. The rancher listened, his heart tightening with each tale. He began to see the herd not only as wealth, but as something sacred, a living treasure tied to survival and dignity. Yet he also knew how the world beyond his fences worked. Men measured worth in cattle, in rail ties, and gold coins. To them, horses were a tool to be broken, a means to plow or pull or race. If word of the herd spread too soon, greedy hands would reach for it. The sisters' legacy would vanish under the weight of profit. That was why the women kept it hidden. why they spoke of the herd in hushed tones only by firelight, as if the night air itself might carry secrets to ears that were not meant to. Here, the rancher could not shake the unease that grew inside him. The herd was close. He knew that much. Some nights, when the wind carried from the east, he heard faint thunder rolling across the plain, though the sky showed no clouds. It was the sound of hooves drumming the earth, 200 strong, waiting. Yet he had never seen them with his own eyes, never been led to their hiding place. The sisters guarded that knowledge, promising only that the time would come when he would be taken to them. Until then, he had to wait. And waiting gnawed at him more than the laughter of his family ever had. The conflict with his kin deepened. They believed he had ruined his future, bound himself to a life of hardship with women who could never be accepted. They called him stubborn, blind, a fool who had traded good sense for romance. But what burned him most was how they spoke about his brides, as if their worth could be measured by the color of their skin or the way they dressed. He wanted to shout the truth in their faces, to tell them about the herd that would one day make their words taste bitter. Yet he held his tongue, because the secret was not his to share. And secrets, he learned, carried a heavy price. There were nights he wondered if the sisters trusted him fully. They shared stories, laughter, and silence with him, yet they never revealed where the herd rested. It was as if they were watching him, weighing his patience, measuring his character before they would open the last gate of trust. He tried to show them with his actions, not his words. He defended them in town, even when it meant walking away from men who had once been friends. He worked beside them without complaint, learning the ways they mended the earth, listening when they spoke, and never dismissing their wisdom. Still, the distance remained, a quiet line between knowing and not knowing. And he wondered how long it would last. The land itself seemed to sense the tension. Coyotes grew bolder near the ranch, circling closer than before. Cattle wandered restless at night, their eyes rolling at shadows unseen. Even the wind carried a strange edge. A low whistle through the canyons that made the horses in his corral stomp and snort nervously. The sisters said little, but he noticed how they exchanged glances more often. How their eyes drifted to the horizon, as if expecting something to appear. When he asked, they answered in riddles, saying only that change was coming, that the land was never quiet without reason. The rancher's unease grew when he caught sight of riders. Near the ridge one evening, strangers, silhouetted against the dying sun, watching the valley below. He knew they weren't neighbors, their posture too stiff, their interest too sharp. When he rode closer, they turned and vanished, dust rising behind them. He said nothing to his family, knowing they would only twist it into another jest. But his brides listened carefully when he told them. Their silence afterward chilled him more than any laughter. As the days turned, his dreams grew restless. He dreamed of hooves pounding in the dark, of endless herds vanishing into dust, of voices calling his name from far-off canyons. He woke with sweat on his brow. The fire burned down to embers, his brides already awake, their faces calm as stone. It was as if they too felt the pull of something unseen, a force drawing nearer with each passing night. He thought often about the weight of legacy. His family measured theirs in acres and cattle, in the ranch passed down from father to son. Yet the sisters carried a different kind of inheritance, one not written on paper or sealed with ink, but alive in the breath of 200 horses. To them, land was not something to own, but something to honor. That difference cut deep, for he saw how the world beyond their valley prized ownership above all else. He wondered how long they could keep their secret before greed came knocking at the gates. Suspicion grew among his kin. They noticed the way the women often slipped away at dawn, returning hours later with dust on their dresses and quiet satisfaction in their eyes. They began whispering that his brides had secrets, that perhaps they were planning to leave him, to shame him even further. He said nothing, though the words stung, because deep down he knew the truth was far more dangerous than their shallow accusations. The days stretched on, and the tension thickened like the heat before a summer storm. The rancher worked harder than ever, his muscles aching, his resolve unbroken. But his thoughts were never far from the herd he had yet to see. The mocking of his family was no longer his greatest burden. What weighed on him now was the knowledge that something vast and powerful rested just beyond reach, waiting for its time. And when that time came, it would not only test his loyalty, but it would change the fate of every soul tied to that land. The valley seemed to hold its breath, as though the earth itself was waiting for revelation. Nights grew louder with the distant thunder of unseen hooves, mornings sharper with the chill of expectation. His bride spoke less now, their eyes watching horizons more than fires. And though he longed for answers, he knew that the silence meant something was drawing near. Something his kin could never laugh away. Something that would shatter their narrow world when it finally broke through. The rancher stood one evening at the edge of his land, the last light fading, the wind carrying the faintest rhythm of hooves. His bride stood beside him, their faces unreadable, their silence heavy. He knew the time was close, but he did not yet know if that time would bring salvation or ruin. And in that moment, as darkness fell and the earth trembled faintly beneath his boots, he understood that the waiting was far from over. It had only just begun. The first hard crack in the quiet came with a stranger riding down from the ridge at noon. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, and carried himself like a man who had counted every fence post in the valley. He said he was a horse buyer from the railhead, here to ask about mustangs. The rancher answered plain, saying his herd was small and his focus was cattle. The stranger's eyes slid past him toward the two Apache women standing by the corral. He tipped his hat, polite in a way that felt like a test, then rode on. That night the sisters said the wind was carrying the wrong kind of dust. The rancher did not sleep. A few days later, the rancher's eldest brother turned up without sending word first. He walked through the house, as if checking an inventory, lifting pots, peering into the pantry, gazing out the back door. His talk circled every subject except the one that sat heavy between them. Finally, he asked where the women rode each dawn and why they kept the rancher from making proper business with neighbors. The rancher told him to keep his curiosity to himself. The brother laughed, saying the family wanted to help him out of his mistake. He left with a smile too smooth to trust. One sister began, spending long hours near the northern gully, where old cottonwoods clung to the bank. The rancher followed one morning and found her balancing on a fallen trunk, watching the shapes of hoofprints in the damp sand. She called him closer and traced a line with her finger where many horses had crossed. The imprints were new, sharp on the edges. The rancher knelt and counted. There were dozens upon dozens. He felt the earth shift in his mind, like a gate lifting. She touched his shoulder and shook her head. Not yet, her eyes warned, and the two rode home in silence. The town grew meaner as harvest neared. Folks whispered that the rancher had turned his back on his own, so that he listened only to people from a world they did not understand. The preacher turned the volume of his voice high, calling for purity and order. Shopkeepers gave short change with long faces. The rancher's sisters by blood passed him on the street without a word. But there were small kindnesses, too. The blacksmith's wife slipped a sack of flour into the wagon bed and said the price had dropped. A boy from the livery handed over a coil of good rope and said he found it by the road. The rancher felt the valley splitting, kindness on one side and fear on the other. One evening, the stranger in the dark coat came back with two men riding behind him. They asked for water and a corner of shade. While they rested, their eyes slid like knives across the yard. They asked if the rancher had seen bands of wild horses. They said the rail company was offering a fine price to break them for freight work. The rancher said no. One sister stepped forward with a calm face and asked how they planned to round up horses that did not belong to them. The stranger smiled and said the land belonged to whoever held the strongest rope. The rancher's jaw clenched as the men rode away. A subplot began to coil itself around the heart of the ranch. Water from the upper creek had been slow for weeks. The rancher rode upstream and found a rough trench cut across the bank.
Not turning.
Flow toward a small camp made of canvas and scrap boards. 3 sunburned men greeted him with hands near their belts. They said they had permission from the county clerk to divert water for a new claim. The rancher knew the clerk liked fast talkers and shuffled papers. He also knew that the creek fed the gully where the sisters watched hoofprints form. He said he would check the records. They told him to do it quick. That night the women taught the rancher how to listen for distant movement. They led him to a ridge and told him to close his eyes. The wind carried two different sounds. One was cattle shifting in a low draw. The other was faint thunder moving like a wave. He opened his eyes and saw nothing but grass and far hills. The sisters said the herd was restless because strangers were near. They were keeping the horses deep in a basin where mesquite closed tight above the paths. The rancher wanted to go now. The elder sister shook her head once more. He would be taken there only when the land was ready to receive him. The rancher's eldest brother returned with a wagon full of fence posts and a ledger under his arm. He said the family had decided to help by putting a foreman in charge. The rancher laughed without humor and asked if that meant the brother planned to move on to the property. The brother said it was for the best. The women were welcome to stay if they kept to the kitchen. The rancher told him the gate would be locked at sundown. The brother left red-faced, and by nightfall a notice was nailed to the ranch gate, threatening legal action for misuse of family assets. The sisters read the words and turned them into tinder for the stove. The cattle market dipped with the season, its money thinned like a worn strap. The rancher rode to the railhead with a small shipment, hoping to keep the hands paid and the pantry stocked. At the station, he saw the stranger again, this time talking to two men in government coats. They carried clipboards and asked for lists of livestock, brands, and acreage. The stranger turned as if by accident and nodded to the rancher, then spoke quietly with the men, pointing toward the valley. The rancher sold his cattle and went home heavy with worry. The women listened and then laid out a new plan, while the rancher slept in the gray hours before dawn. The sisters rode to the basin to ready the horses for movement if danger came too close. They looped long lines of yucca fiber from tree to tree to mark hidden paths. They left small pieces of cloth at eye height for the herd leaders, signals only a trained animal would understand. The elder sister hummed an old tune that kept foals steady at river crossings. The younger checked the edges of the basin for traps. At sunrise, they returned with dust on their boots and clear determination in their eyes. They told the rancher it would soon be time to see what he had promised to protect. The rancher set to preparing his own defense. He oiled the hinges on barn doors and patched weak planks in the corral. He stored sacks of oats and set aside clean water, not for cattle, but for horses he had not yet touched. He traded discreetly for salt and medicine in town. When the blacksmith raised a brow, the rancher said coyotes had been hard on the calves. The blacksmith's wife slipped him a small pouch with herbs and told him to burn them when false friends came near. He took the pouch without a word and rode home through the scrub. Tension inside the family rose to a breaking point. The rancher's mother sent a letter by a neighbor asking him to come alone to Sunday supper. He went, though he knew the shape of the trap. Around the table, the talk turned soft and careful at first. They asked if he was happy. They asked if the women treated him well. Then the questions sharpened. How much of the ranch had he given away? How many of his decisions were made by outsiders? When he stayed silent, the eldest brother slammed his glass down and accused him of hiding resources that should belong to the whole family. The rancher stood, thanked his mother for the meal, and walked out into the cool night. Behind him, voices clashed like steel. The next day brought proof that words had turned to plans. The stranger's men set up a camp within sight of the northern gully. They stacked coils of rope and built a rough fence from saplings. They dug a pit and hid it with brush. By sunset, they had 3 more riders circling the ridgeline. The rancher watched from a distance. The sisters watched too, their faces calm but tight at the mouth. The younger said the herd would not step into a trap unless driven in panic. The elder said panic comes easy when men begin to shout. The rancher felt sweat bead at the back of his neck. Meanwhile, a new thread wove itself into the tale. A teacher from town, a quiet woman with a spine of steel, began visiting the ranch with books for children of the valley. She carried a small library in a canvas sack and left a primer and a reader on the kitchen table. She spoke with the sisters in gentle tones and asked about words in their language. She wrote them in neat columns and practiced the sounds until she got them right. The rancher noticed the way the women's faces softened with respect. The teacher mentioned that the county clerk had been filing land notices in odd ways. She could not prove harm, but she could smell it. With enemies at the ridge and paperwork twisting like a snake in the county files, the rancher decided to test the loyalty of those who had once called him friend. He visited the blacksmith after closing and asked for help if trouble came without warning. The blacksmith said he was too old for fights but not too old to turn a hot bar into something sturdy. He gave the rancher a bundle wrapped in burlap, tools strong enough to cut wire or pry open a gate. He told the rancher to pay him with a fair story when this was over. The rancher promised he would. The sisters took the rancher to the basin at last, but not by day. They woke him in the deepest dark and led him along a switchback path that opened into a hush so complete it felt like church. The herd stood there under the stars, 200 shapes breathing as one. A lead mare stepped forward and tossed her head. The elder sister raised her hand in a sign somewhere between a welcome and a command. The horses shifted, forming a loose ring around them. The rancher felt very small and very seen. He reached out, slow and respectful, until warm hair brushed his palm. In that instant, the weight of all the mocking words fell away. Then the elder sister spoke low. The herd would move before the next moonrise. The path would pass near the stranger's camp. They planned by lantern light on a flat rock above the basin. The women would guide the herd through the mesquite maze. The rancher would ride ahead to clear the route and stall the strangers if he could. The teacher would visit the county office the same day and ask the clerk to show his records. Buying time with questions, the man could not answer quickly. The blacksmith would spread word, careful and quiet, to those who still held a piece of honor in their hearts. Every step felt fragile. If one part broke, the whole plan might scatter like a flock that senses a hawk. The rancher returned home to find a paper tacked to his door by a deputy with nervous eyes. It claimed the county had received complaints about unregistered stock and land misuse. It gave a date for a hearing and demanded that all animals be presented for counting. The rancher ran a thumb across the official stamp and saw the ink was fresh enough to smear. He folded the paper into his pocket and thanked the deputy for his long ride. The man touched his hat and said to be careful near the northern ridge. Then he rode off fast, as if smoke were on his heels. On the final night before the move, the valley held a brittle quiet. Coyotes kept away. Owls hunted without calling. The wind blew straight and steady from the east. The rancher saddled his horse and checked each strap twice. The sisters braided their hair tight and tied thin cords around their wrists, reminders of old vows. The teacher arranged her papers and tucked a worn pencil behind her ear. The blacksmith banked his fire and left a bucket of tools beside the door. The stranger's camp on the ridge burned bright like a taunt. Far beyond, in the hidden basin, 200 horses lifted their heads as one. The rancher looked toward the ridge and saw tiny sparks dropping into the dark. Men lighting fresh lanterns to watch whatever might come. He felt fear move through him, as real as thirst, but he did not let it take hold. He thought of the herd's breath against his hand, of the quiet pride in the sisters' eyes, of the thin line between ownership and stewardship that the old American plains had always drawn. He mounted and turned his horse toward the path. Behind him, the women swung into their saddles with the easy grace of people who had been riding since childhood. The first stars vanished behind a moving layer of cloud. They rode toward the basin with the sound of the stranger's camp fading behind, replaced by the low thunder that had lived in their dreams. The land opened like a book they had studied every day of their lives. Trails they had walked in daylight now glimmered in the half-dark. When they reached the ridge above the basin, sisters dismounted and stood with hands lifted, voices carrying a steady song into the night. The herd began to move, first as a ripple, then as a wave. The rancher watched the doorway of the valley narrow into a treacherous throat of brush and stone. It was the only safe passage. It ran within sight of the men who wanted to claim what was not theirs, far away at the county office. Lamps burned over the clerk's desk as the teacher asked for each record in turn. She found misplaced pages and missing signatures, lines crossed, and dates altered. She copied numbers onto clean paper and made the clerk read them back twice. His face grew pale as she asked for explanations he did not have. She spoke in the calm voice of a person who knows how to hold a schoolroom together during a storm. By the time he reached for the drawer that hid the worst of it, dawn was sending pale light over the WIN Dove, back at the ranch. The first edge of the herd slipped from shadow to open ground, the lead mare placing each hoof with care. The rancher rode ahead to watch the ridge. A lantern flared and a shout rose. The strangers had seen the moving line of horses. Ropes whistled through the air from the trap they had set near the gully. The elder sister raised her arm, and the herd fanned wide with sudden speed, bodies flowing like water around rocks. The younger called out a warning, and 3 stallions surged forward to shield the foals. Dust rose in a thick wall between horses and men. The rancher wheeled his horse toward the trap and saw the pit covered with brush. He cut the first sapling fence with the tool wrapped in burlap, hands steady despite the pounding in his chest. Men shouted on the ridge. A rope caught his shoulder and yanked him sideways, but he slashed it free and kept moving. The herd thundered past, split by the mesquite maze into 2 streams. From the ridge came the low growl of more riders pouring from the camp. The rancher glimpsed the stranger in the dark coat, eyes bright with surprise and calculation. For a breath, the world narrowed to dust, hooves, and heat. Then the wind shifted. The dust wall leaned toward the ridge, swallowing lantern light. Horses poured through the throat of the valley like a river breaking its banks. The sisters rode on either side of the flow, calling commands the herd had known since before fences. The strangers' riders hesitated, blinded by grit. The rancher cut the last sapling and watched the brush covering the pit sink under its own weight. Somewhere behind him a man cursed loud and sharp. He turned to follow the herd, but a shadow moved in the dust, and a hand grabbed his bridle. The stranger had come down off the ridge after all, and his grip was sure. The rancher's horse reared, and the bridle leather creaked. The stranger leaned close, voice smooth but edged with steel, and said this valley was changing, whether the rancher liked it or not. If the herd left, the county would take the land on claim of misused resources. If the herd stayed, it would be broken and sold behind a wall of paper. The rancher met his eyes and said one truth that mattered. Not everything that moves can be held. The stranger smiled without warmth and let go of the bridle. He stepped back into the dust and vanished like a snake into brush. The herd streamed on toward country the sisters had mapped in their bones. The rancher found his place beside them, vision blurring from dust and strain. Behind, the ridge flickered with angry lights. Ahead, the basin opened into a wide plain marked by dry arroyos and blue sage. The sisters urged the lead mare toward a path that curled behind a low hill and out of sight of the ridge. The rancher felt the land lift under the weight of pounding hooves, like a drum calling every living thing to attention. And though the path ahead was still veiled, one fact settled hard in his chest. The conflict had stepped out of whispers and into daylight, and every choice from this point would carry a cost he could not yet measure. The herd thundered through the narrow valley, dust rising in thick clouds that swallowed moonlight. The rancher rode hard beside the sisters, each of them guiding the wave of horses like currents in a storm. Every hoofbeat shook the earth, a living drum that seemed to echo across the plains. Behind them came the sharp cries of riders giving chase, lanterns flickering like restless fireflies on the ridge. The rancher glanced back once and saw the stranger in his dark coat, still upright in the saddle, face set with a determination that promised he would not let go easily. The sight made the rancher's chest tighten. He knew this was no longer just about land or cattle or pride. This was about power, about who would command the valley's future. The sisters kept their focus ahead, calling low and steady to the herd, their words flowing like a song that wove through the chaos. The rancher felt the animals respond, tightening their formation, staying close even as fear pressed them forward. He realized then that the horses trusted the women in ways no man with rope or whip could ever understand. Their calm, their certainty, was the only thing keeping the herd from breaking apart in blind panic. He pushed his own horse harder to keep pace, determined not to falter. The land ahead stretched wide and empty, a plain of brittle grass and dry creek beds. The sisters aimed the herd toward a low rise, where the earth folded back into a shallow basin, a place hidden enough to buy time. But the riders behind were gaining ground. Their shouts cut through the night, sharp and commanding, ropes whistling as they tested their reach. The rancher ducked low in the saddle as a loop sailed past his head, the hiss of rope close enough to raise the hairs on his neck. He swung his arm wide and cracked the air with his reins, urging his mount faster. The herd flowed like water, but water can be dammed, and the riders knew it. They spread across the ridge, looking for ways to funnel the horses into their trap. The rancher spotted movement along the flanks, more men closing in with torches. Flames arced in the dark, throwing light across the dust. The herd balked at the glow, some veering wide, others slowing with nervous snorts. The elder sister raised her voice louder, her words rising into a chant that steadied the lead mare. The younger one rode along the far side, urging strays back toward the center. The rancher rode the middle, heart pounding, trying to keep the wave unbroken. Each moment stretched taut as wire. The rancher thought of his family's laughter, their words dripping with scorn, and how blind they had been to the truth of this legacy. He thought of the teacher in town, still holding the clerk's feet to the fire with her questions, buying them time with ink and paper while the real fight raged out here in dust and hooves. He thought of the blacksmith's warning, of tools made to cut through lies as well as saplings. Every piece of it pressed together in his mind, forming a knot of tension that could not hold much longer. The chase dragged on into the darkest hours before dawn. The riders pressed closer, their horses lathered with sweat, their voices cracking with urgency. The rancher's mount stumbled once, hooves striking a rock, but he steadied it with firm hands and a muttered prayer. The herd pushed forward, eyes rolling white in the glow of the torches. Dust coated the rancher's tongue, stinging his eyes until tears carved clean tracks down his face. He did not wipe them away. He had no free hand to spare. The plain ahead narrowed into a funnel between two ridges. The sisters had chosen this path, but the rancher now understood its danger. If the riders reached the mouth first, they could choke off the herd, drive them straight into snares. He leaned low and shouted to the elder sister, asking if the passage was safe. She nodded once, her expression unreadable, and kept singing. He forced his doubts down and pushed onward. The roar of hooves grew louder as the herd entered the funnel, walls of rock rising on either side. The sound bounced back in waves, a deafening thunder that rattled the rancher's bones. The riders behind raised their torches higher, the firelight painting twisted shadows across the canyon walls. The stranger's voice cut through the din, calm and cold, giving orders to box the herd. The rancher's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct told him this was the moment everything would break. They burst through the narrow throat and into the basin beyond. For a heartbeat, the world opened wide again, stars overhead, land stretching endless. Relief washed over the rancher, but it lasted only a breath. More riders waited ahead, silhouettes against the pale sky of coming dawn. The stranger had planned well. They were caught between two forces, and the herd, already trembling with fear, had nowhere safe to run. The sisters acted without hesitation. The elder raised her arms wide, her voice carrying a sharp command that cut through the noise. The lead mare reared high, hooves striking the air, and the herd fanned out in a sudden surge. The younger sister darted left, guiding a stream of horses toward a hidden path that curled behind brush. The rancher followed her lead, cutting across the middle, shouting to drive the animals away from the waiting ropes. Torches flared, men shouted, and chaos exploded. Horses screamed as ropes snapped against their hides. Dust rose in choking waves, and the basin shook with the struggle of muscle against muscle. The rancher saw a foal stumble, tangled in brush, and swerved hard to cut it free. His arm burned as he slashed the rope away, and he nearly lost his seat when his horse leaped aside. He caught sight of the stranger again, riding calm at the center, eyes fixed not on the herd, but on the women guiding it. The rancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with night air. The fight dragged into dawn. The first light spread across the plain, turning dust into gold, but there was no beauty in it. Every shadow seemed filled with danger, every heartbeat louder than the last. The sisters' songs grew hoarse, their voices raw with effort, but the herd still listened, still moved as one. The rancher pushed his horse until its sides heaved, sweat streaming down both their bodies. He could not stop. None of them could. By mid-morning, the plain had become a battlefield of hooves, ropes, and will. The herd split and reformed. Men rode and fell. and the land itself seemed to tremble under the weight of so many lives colliding. The rancher's arms shook from gripping reins, his chest burned with each breath, but still he rode on. The sisters moved with unbroken focus, their strength carrying the herd forward even as exhaustion clawed at them. The stranger never faltered, his dark coat a mark among the chaos, his gaze steady, patient, as if he knew the end was already written. But the rancher knew different. He felt it in the ground, in the living thunder of 200 horses that would not bow to greed. The herd was more than wealth, more than survival. It was freedom itself, moving through dust and fire, refusing to be broken. He shouted until his voice cracked, until his throat was raw, until the air itself seemed to shiver with the force of it. The sisters raised their voices too, weaving their strength into the storm. The herd surged one final time, a wall of bodies pressing against the riders, breaking through lines of rope and torch. Dust swallowed the plain, blinding all who stood in its path. The rancher rode into the storm, heart hammering, knowing the next moments would decide everything. The stranger's voice rose once more, sharp and commanding, but it was drowned by the roar of hooves. By the living force that no man could truly control, the world narrowed to sound and motion. Dust and breath, hooves and heartbeats. The rancher felt himself pulled into the very center of it, the eye of the storm. Ahead, the herd poured toward an opening in the land, a path that might lead them free or straight into ruin. Behind, riders pressed hard, their torches sputtering in the storm of dust. Between them all, the stranger stood tall in the saddle, waiting, his face unreadable, as though he had planned for this very moment. And as the herd thundered closer to that uncertain path, the rancher knew the true climax had not yet come. It waited just ahead, hidden in the dust, where fate would decide who held the valley and who would be broken by it. The air thickened, time slowed, and every breath tasted of dust and destiny. The storm of hooves grew louder, louder still, until it drowned out every thought but one. The moment of reckoning was upon them. The herd poured through the opening like a river bursting its banks, dust thick as smoke, and the earth trembling under the weight of so many pounding hooves. The rancher rode at the center, eyes stinging, throat raw, muscles aching from the long night's battle. He could see little through the storm of dust. Only the blur of horses pressing forward, the flash of manes, and the ripple of muscle. The sisters flanked the herd, their voices carrying over the thunder, guiding, commanding, steadying. Even when fear clawed at the animals, they did not scatter. They trusted the voices they had known since birth. The stranger had tried to hold his line at the ridge. The dust and the sheer force of the herd swallowed him whole. His men scattered like dry leaves before a gale. Some shouted in panic. Others tried to throw ropes only to be dragged from the saddle when their loops caught nothing but air. Torches sputtered and went dark, smothered in clouds of grit. The rancher saw riders turn their mounts away, unwilling to be crushed beneath the living tide. For all his planning and all his threats, the stranger had underestimated the power of 200 horses bound together by loyalty and song. When the herd finally broke free of the funnel and spilled onto open land, the rising sun painted the plain gold. Dust rolled behind them in a great wave, blotting out the men left on the ridge. The rancher rode with his brides until the thunder eased into a steady drumbeat and the danger no longer pressed. Against their backs, the horses slowed as they entered a wide basin ringed with mesquite and stone, a place the sisters had chosen long ago as sanctuary. There, at last, the herd settled. Foals pressed against their mothers, stallions snorted. Mares pawed the ground as if claiming it anew. The rancher dismounted, legs shaking, and dropped to his knees in the dust. His chest heaved, his hands trembled, yet his heart beat steady. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. This herd was no ordinary wealth, no simple stock to be broken and sold. It was legacy, power, and freedom, all bound together. The sisters stood tall beside him, their faces calm, their braids dusted with grit, their eyes bright with pride. They had protected what their people had carried through generations. And now he understood fully why they had chosen him to stand with them by the time they returned to the ranch. The valley had changed. Word spread fast of what had happened in the basin. Some said the horses had risen like a storm sent by heaven. Others claimed the women had worked old magic to scatter the men who tried to steal what was not theirs. Whatever the stories, the truth was clear. The rancher and his brides now commanded the respect of the valley, not through bloodlines or cattle, but through the undeniable presence of 200 horses under their care. The stranger vanished after that day. Some whispered he rode south to chase easier prey. Others swore they had seen him boarding a train at the railhead, coat dusty, eyes hollow. His men scattered, unwilling to speak of the dust storm that had undone them. The county clerk, pressed by the teacher's questions and the papers she carried back to town, folded under scrutiny. His false filings were revealed, his schemes exposed. He left his post in disgrace, muttering excuses no one cared to hear. The teacher stayed on, her school growing, her respect in the valley deepening. She became a friend to the rancher's family, though it was the sisters who found in her a true ally, someone who honored their language and kept their stories alive in written word. The rancher's kin came with their heads lowered, shame burning in their eyes. They had mocked him when they thought he had chosen foolishly, but now they saw what he had truly gained. The eldest brother, once so quick with scorn, stood silent before the corral where the lead mare grazed, unable to speak a word. The mother, stern and unbending for so long, wept quietly when the younger sister placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. In time, the family came to understand that strength does not always look the way tradition teaches. Some wounds remained, but respect returned where ridicule once lived. Life on the ranch changed in ways no one could have predicted. The herd became both shield and lifeline. Traders came from far towns, eager for horses strong enough to pull, fast enough to ride, wise enough to learn. Yet the sisters were careful. They allowed only a few to leave, never breaking the bond of the herd, never selling more than the land could spare. The ranch grew not just in wealth but in reputation. It became known as a place where old ways and new ways walked side by side, where respect meant more than greed, and where freedom was not for sale. The rancher no longer walked through town with bowed head. He walked steady, his brides at his side, his eyes forward. Some still whispered, for whispers never fully die, but now their tones held awe more than mockery. Children who once laughed now ran to see the horses when they came to market. Neighbors who once turned away now offered a hand in greeting. Even the preacher softened his sermons, speaking of unity and respect instead of division. The valley itself seemed to breathe easier, as though the land had been waiting for someone to carry its truth forward. The blacksmith smiled when the rancher came to his shop, saying he had known the man had more grit than his family gave him credit for. He asked for the promised story, and the rancher gave it in full. Every detail from the first whispers in town to the dust storm in the basin. The blacksmith nodded, eyes shining, and said it was worth more than coin. The teacher, too, recorded what she heard, writing it carefully in her journals so the tale would not fade. She said the story was not just one man's but belonged to the valley, to the people, to the land itself. In quiet moments, when the chores were done and the fires burned low, the rancher sat with the sisters and watched the herd graze under moonlight. The horses moved like shadows, their breath silver in the night air, their hooves stirring the earth in slow rhythm. He felt peace then, a peace he had never known in all the years of labor and loneliness. He had been mocked, scorned, doubted, yet here he sat with a life richer than any cattle baron or banker could boast. The lesson of it all was not lost on him. He understood now that strength is not measured in acres or coin, nor in the approval of kin who cannot see beyond their own pride. True strength lies in trust, in unity, in choosing what is right even when the world calls it folly. He had chosen love when others urged him to choose pride. He had chosen respect when others urged him to choose control. In return, he had been given something greater than he ever dreamed. Seasons turned, years passing like pages in a worn book. The ranch thrived, not because it grew larger, but because it grew deeper. The sisters taught the rancher their songs, their ways of listening to wind and water, their understanding of the bond between land and life. He, in turn, taught them how to work the markets, how to protect their rights on paper as well as in practice. Together, They wove old and new into a single fabric that could not be torn by greed or mockery. The valley remembered too. Long after the stranger was gone and the clerk forgotten, the tale of the rancher who married 2 Apache women lived on. It was told at campfires and kitchens and schoolrooms. Some told it as a story of defiance, others as a story of love, still others as a story of freedom. But no matter the telling, one truth remained clear. Those who mocked him had been blind, and those who stood with him had seen something worth more than all the gold or cattle in the land. In the end, the rancher needed no grand words to explain his life. When strangers passed through and asked about the herd, about the women, about the story whispered in towns up and down the rail line, he simply smiled and pointed toward the wide plain where the horses moved like flowing water. There, under the sun, was the answer to every question, the proof of every choice. 200 horses grazing free, bound not by ropes, but by trust. As the years stretched on, the rancher often thought back to that first day when laughter and scorn had been his only companions. He could still hear the voices of his kin mocking, still see the faces of neighbors turned away. Yet those memories no longer stung. They only reminded him how far he had come, how far they all had come, from the dust of ridicule to the freedom of truth. And so the story closed, not with triumph shouted loud, but with quiet strength carried steady. A man, his 2 brides, and the herd they had protected together stood as proof that sometimes the world does not understand what is worth protecting until it is almost lost. In the end, the ranch was not just land, not just cattle, not just horses. It was a place where love, respect, and legacy lived side by side. Stronger than any storm, the valley slept easy under stars, the herd grazed in peace. And the rancher knew with certainty that he had chosen the right path all along. The laughter of mockery had long faded into silence, replaced by the steady thunder of hooves that would echo across generations. And in that sound, in that rhythm of freedom and life, the story found its lasting truth.